Part 1, A Gift and a Goodbye. The day I left the maternity center was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life. Instead, it felt like the coldest. James arrived with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, carrying my favorite chestnut cake in one hand and, of all things, a divorce agreement in the other. "Vivian is coming back," he said casually, as if that single sentence didn't just rip apart the life we had built together. I stared at the papers in front of me, my heart pounding, my fingers trembling. The company belongs to the husband. All other property belongs to the wife and the child. It was exactly what I wanted. I should have been relieved, even happy. But I knew better than to show my cards too early. I furrowed my brows slightly, forcing my voice to sound uncertain. "James, we built this company together. Years of hard work. Are you really in such a hurry to push me out?" James exhaled impatiently and handed me a pen. "Evelyn, you know we founded this company for Vivian's dream. Apart from the company, you can have everything else." There it was. The truth, in its ugliest form. I swallowed the bitter taste rising in my throat and took the pen from his hand, signing without hesitation. James blinked, surprised at my lack of protest. "For years of marriage, and you have no nostalgia? No regret?" I glanced down at the sleeping baby in my arms, then met his gaze with a smile, small, cold, and final. "Wish you and Miss Vivian a long and happy life. James Cooten." Wait to drive me straight to the Civil Affairs Bureau. The ink on our divorce certificate had barely dried when I saw something on his face I hadn't seen in years. Happiness. It was the look of a man unshackled, free at last. I turned away before the sight of it could carve deeper wounds into my already broken heart. By the time we reached home, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the walls of the house that was no longer mine. The baby, oblivious to the storm around him, slept peacefully under the nanny's care. James stood by the crib, staring at the child, something flickering in his expression. Guilt? Doubt? I didn't care. "Have you thought of a name?" he asked. I almost laughed at his hypocrisy. He had already thrown us away, yet he still wanted to play the part of a doting father. "Ethan," I said simply. James frowned. "Ethan? This is my child. Shouldn't I have a say in?" "The divorce agreement says otherwise," I cut him off. "But don't worry. You'll always be his father. When he grows up, if you want to see him, I won't stop you." James sighed, a hint of something close to regret darkening his features. "Thank you, Evelyn. I won't skimp on child support in the future." I let out a soft, bitter chuckle. "No need. I can afford to raise him myself. You should focus on your own happiness first." James checked his phone, already distracted, already slipping away. "Okay, then. Goodbye." "Goodbye, James." I watched as he walked out the door. The moment it clicked shut behind him, I felt an unfamiliar lightness in my chest. Freedom. The second James left, I blocked his number, deleted his contacts, and put every single one of our 3 properties up for sale. I priced them 5% lower than the market rate, ensuring they'd be snatched up quickly. Within days, I had sold 2 of them, using the money to buy a school district house in full. The rest went into a bank account, where it could sit safely, waiting for the day I would rise again. I was done being the woman left behind. I was going to make sure I never needed a man like James ever again. Then, one evening, the phone rang. An unfamiliar number. I debated ignoring it, but some strange instinct, made me pick up. "Is this Evelyn?" A woman's voice asked. It was soft, trembling, and painfully familiar. Vivian. My heart clenched. What could she possibly want? It's me, I answered coolly. What's the matter? There was urgency in her voice. James. He had a car accident. His blood type doesn't match mine. Can you come and donate blood to him? I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. James and I had been divorced for nearly half a year. He had married Vivian the day after we separated. Now, she was calling me to beg for my blood? Did she think I was some cheap, disposable thing she could summon whenever she pleased? Sorry, Miss Vivian, I said, my voice even and cold. James and I have no relationship anymore. You've got the wrong person. Silence. Then, a shaky breath. I just came back to the country. I don't know anyone else. Please, please save him. I leaned back, tapping. My fingers against the counter. Vivian, you've been abroad for years. Maybe you don't know this, but James doesn't have a rare blood type. The blood bank has plenty. You should be talking to a doctor, not me. And with that, I hung up. Let her handle her own mess. James was no longer my problem. That night, as I lay in bed, memories came rushing back. The way James had smiled at me on our wedding day. The way he had held my hand when we built the company together, our dreams intertwined. The way he had whispered promises in the dark, only to shatter every single one of them for a woman who had never even been there. And, of course, the moment I realized the truth. It had been 3 years into our marriage when James got drunk for the first time. I had never seen him that way before, his consciousness slipping, his words slurring. As I helped the driver carry him inside, his voice cracked through the silence. Vivian. Vivian, I miss you. My blood had run cold. I had spent years building a life with this man, only to realize I was nothing more than a stand-in. A replacement for the woman he truly loved. That night, I stayed awake beside him, watching the man. I had devoted my life to call out another woman's name in his sleep. And I had smiled. Because that was the moment I knew, one day, I would walk away. And when I did, I would take everything. James had made his choice. Vivian had won. And now, she was the one calling me, begging for help. Fate was a cruel thing. I closed my eyes, inhaled deeply, and let sleep take me. I had a new life to build. And nothing, not James, not Vivian, not their twisted love story, was going to stop me. Part 2, The Price of Love. James had once been my world. Now, he was just another name from my past. After I hung up on Vivian, I expected silence. But the next morning, my phone rang again. Same number. I let it ring. And ring. Until finally, my curiosity got the better of me. I picked up. Vivian, what do you want now? There was no hesitation this time, only desperation. James is in critical condition. The doctor said if he doesn't get blood soon, he might. She stopped, choking on her words. I waited, my fingers tapping against the kitchen counter. Might what, Vivian? Her voice was barely above a whisper. He might die. A long silence stretched between us. And for the first time I hesitated. Not because I still loved James. Those feelings had been buried long ago. But because I knew what regret tasted like, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to swallow it again. He's your husband now, I said finally. Isn't this your problem? A sharp inhale from her end. Evelyn, please. I know you hate me. I know you have every reason to. But James, he's not just my husband. He's Ethan's father. Please, if not for him, then for your son. My son. I glanced at the crib in the corner of the room, where Ethan was sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm raging outside these walls. For a moment, my heart wavered. Then, just as quickly, it hardened again. You must fin. I'm a fool, I said, voice sharp as a knife. Do you think I forgot how James abandoned me in the hospital? Do you think I forgot how you stood in my place, smiling, while I signed away my marriage? Do you think I forgot that the moment I gave birth to his child, he was too busy picking you up from the airport to even bother being there? Vivian went quiet. I continued, my tone unwavering. You made your choice, Vivian. You won. And now, you want me to clean up your mess? Evelyn. I hung up. This time, I didn't hesitate. But something about our conversation wouldn't leave me alone. James was dying. And as much as I wanted to pretend it didn't matter, a small part of me, the part that had once loved him, felt a pang of something close to guilt. I shook it off. I had moved on. I had made my plans. And nothing, absolutely nothing, would change that. A few days later, I was sipping my morning coffee when my phone buzzed again. But this time, it wasn't Vivian. It was James's assistant. Miss Evelyn? Her voice was hesitant. I sighed. If this is about James, save your breath. I don't care. There was a pause. Then, a hesitant, I just thought you should know, he's been asking for you. I almost dropped my coffee. I forced a laugh. Why would he ask for me? He won't say it outright, she admitted, but every time he wakes up, he looks at the door like he's expecting someone. And yesterday, when I mentioned your name, She hesitated. I leaned forward. He what? He started crying. A sharp pain lanced through my chest. Crying? James? I had known him for years. He never cried. Not when we were struggling to build our company. Not when we fought. Not even when we divorced. So why now? I swallowed. That's not my problem anymore. Another pause. Then, softer, you're right. It's not. But I just thought you should know, the doctors say he doesn't have much time left. I gripped the edge of the table. Goodbye, Miss Evelyn. The line went dead. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, haunted by memories I had tried to bury. The way James used to look at me, before Vivian. The way he used to call me his partner, his equal. The way he had kissed my forehead the day we started our company, promising we would build something great together. And the way he had abandoned me, just as easily. I clenched my fists. James didn't deserve my forgiveness. But maybe, just maybe, he deserved to see his son one last time. The next morning, I made a decision. I would go to the hospital. Not for James. Not for Vivian. But for Ethan. He might never remember his father, but I wanted to be able to look my son in the eyes one day and tell him, honestly, that I had given James one last chance. I dressed simply, pulling my hair back into a low ponytail. When I arrived at the hospital, the smell of antiseptic filled my nose, sharp and sterile. James's room was easy to find. Room 302. I took a deep breath, then stepped inside. James was lying in the hospital bed, looking thinner, paler. The once proud man who had built an empire now looked like a shadow of himself. His eyes were closed, his breathing slow. I hesitated. Then, softly, James? His eyelids fluttered. Slowly, painfully, he turned his head toward me. For a moment, he just stared. Then, his lips parted. Evelyn. It was barely a whisper, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. I swallowed. You look terrible. A faint, ghostly smile. Still as blunt as ever. I folded my arms. I heard you've been asking for me. A long silence. Then, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. I'm sorry. I stiffened. James reached out weakly, as if to touch me, then let his hand fall back onto the bed. I was a fool, he murmured. I spent years chasing a dream, not realizing I had already lost the best thing I ever had. I looked away. That's not my problem anymore, James. I know, he said softly. But I needed to tell you. Before it's too late. I inhaled sharply. James looked at me, something raw and broken in his eyes. Evelyn, can I see our son? I froze. This was the moment I had prepared for. The moment. I had told myself I would refuse. And yet, looking at him now, fragile and fading, I felt my resolve crack. I exhaled. I'll think about it. James smiled, a real, genuine smile. That's more than I deserve. I turned toward the door. Get some rest, James. As I reached for the handle, his voice stopped me one last time. Evelyn? I glanced back. Thank you for coming. For the first time in a long time, I didn't know how to respond. So I just walked away. Part 3, A Choice to Make. I walked out of James's hospital room feeling like I had stepped into another lifetime. The corridors stretched endlessly before me, sterile and cold. My heels clicked against the linoleum floor, a sharp contrast to the silence that surrounded me. I shouldn't have come. That was the thought that echoed in my head as I left the hospital. But then I remembered the way James had looked at me, frail, broken, full of regret. I wasn't sure why, but something about it unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I got into my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. James wanted to see Ethan. Could I allow that? Would I allow that? Ethan was still just a baby. He wouldn't remember meeting his father. Wouldn't remember the man who had abandoned him the moment he was born. But one day, when he was older, would he resent me for not giving him the chance? I didn't know the answer. All I knew was that I had spent years learning how to hate James. And now, in his final days, he was asking for something I wasn't sure I could give. I spent the rest of the day trying to push it all aside, but the thoughts wouldn't leave me alone. By the time evening fell, I found myself pacing in my living room, staring at Ethan as he lay peacefully in his crib. My mother, who had been helping care for him, watched me with a knowing expression. Something's on your mind, she said simply. I sighed, rubbing my temples. It's James. He's in the hospital. He wants to see Ethan. My mother didn't react right away. She just folded her arms and studied me carefully. And what do you want? She asked. I swallowed hard. I don't know. She nodded as if she understood. You're afraid that if you take Ethan to see him, it'll make you weak. I flinched. That's not it. But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't entirely true. My mother sighed and sat down on the couch. Evelyn, let me tell you something. When you love someone, truly love them, you don't stop, even when they hurt you. You just learn to live without them. I clenched my jaw. I don't love James anymore. She smiled faintly. Maybe not. But I think you once did. And maybe that's why this is so hard for you. I sat down beside her, feeling the weight of her words settle on my shoulders. Do you think I should take Ethan to see him? I asked quietly. She was silent for a long moment. Then she looked at me, her gaze steady. I think, one day, Ethan will ask about his father. And when that day comes, what kind of answer do you want to give him? That N. I barely slept. The next morning, I made my decision. I packed a small bag for Ethan, dressed him in his softest onesie, and called for my driver. I didn't know if I was making the right choice. But for my son's sake, I was willing to find out. When I arrived at the hospital, James's assistant met me at the entrance, her eyes widening in shock as she saw Ethan in my arms. Miss Evelyn, she stammered. You. Where is he? I interrupted. She quickly led me down the hallway toward James's room. As we neared the door, I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. What if this was a mistake? What if seeing James again only reopened wounds I had spent so long trying to heal? But then Ethan stirred in my arms, his tiny fingers curling around the fabric of my dress. And suddenly, I knew. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about my son. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the room. James looked even worse than before. His skin was pale, his cheekbones sharp against his gaunt face. His eyes were closed, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. For a moment, I thought he was asleep. But then, as if sensing my presence, his eyelids fluttered open. And when he saw Ethan in my arms, his breath hitched. Ethan, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, letting him take in the sight of the son he had never known. Slowly, James reached out a trembling hand. I hesitated for only a second before stepping closer, lowering Ethan just enough for James to see him clearly. He looks just like me, James murmured, his fingers barely grazing Ethan's tiny hand. Ethan stirred but didn't cry. Instead, he gazed at James with wide, curious eyes. James swallowed hard, his eyes glistening with something I couldn't quite name. I never got to hold him, he admitted softly. A lump formed in my throat. That was your choice, James. IKN. Ow, he said, his voice thick with regret. And I'll never forgive myself for it. Silence filled the room. For the first time in a long time, I saw James not as the man who had abandoned me, not as the husband who had betrayed me, but as a father who was finally facing the weight of his own mistakes. James blinked rapidly, as if trying to hold back tears. Thank you, Evelyn, for bringing him. I looked down at my son, then back at James. You should rest, I said, my voice softer than I intended. James nodded weakly, his gaze still locked on Ethan. Can I see him again? He asked. I hesitated. Then, finally, I gave a small nod. Maybe, I said quietly. If you're still here. James's lips parted slightly in surprise. But before he could say anything else, I turned and walked out of the room. I didn't look back. Outside the hospital, I stood still for a long time, my heart hammering in my chest. I had done what I came to do. But somehow, instead of closure, I felt something else. Something. I couldn't quite name. And deep down, I had a feeling this wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. Part 4, Unfinished Business. As I walked out of the hospital, the cold morning air wrapped around me like a warning, chilling me to the bone. I had done what I came to do. I had let James see his son. And yet, instead of feeling relief, I felt something else gnawing at me. Regret? No. Pity? Maybe. But most of all, it was a sense of something unfinished. Something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Back at home, I tried to settle into my usual routine. I fed Ethan. Played with him, watched as he giggled and reached for my face with his tiny fingers. But James's words kept replaying in my head. Can I see him again? I had given him a maybe. But deep down, I knew the truth. James was running out of time. And I needed to decide, would I let him see Ethan again before it was too late? Or would I let him die knowing he had lost everything? Days passed. I didn't visit the hospital again. I told myself I had done enough. But then, on the fourth day, my phone rang. Gee again. It wasn't Vivian. It wasn't James's assistant. It was James. I stared at the screen for a long time, my heart pounding. Then, slowly, I pressed accept. A long silence filled the line before I finally heard his voice. Evelyn. He sounded weaker. More tired. I tightened my grip on the phone. James. He let out a shaky breath. I don't know how much longer I have. But I needed to hear your voice again. My chest ached. James. I don't expect anything from you, he interrupted. I don't deserve anything from you. But there's something I need to tell you before it's too late. I swallowed hard. What is it? Another pause. Then, softly. The company is dying, Evelyn. I frowned. Vivian Media? He let out a humorless chuckle. Vivian Media is a disaster. But I'm talking about something bigger. I stood up, my pulse quickening. James, what are you talking about? He coughed, a deep, rattling sound that made my stomach twist. I made a mistake, he admitted. I trusted the wrong people. I let Vivian handle things she wasn't ready for. And now? A long breath. Evelyn, I don't have much time left. But you, he stopped, coughing again, this time harder. You're the only person I trust to fix this. I froze. What? The company, James said. You built it just as much as I did. Maybe more. And now, it's falling apart. I shook my head. James, that's not my problem anymore. Maybe not, he admitted. But do you really want to see everything you worked for go to waste? I closed my eyes. Damn him. Damn him for knowing exactly how to get to me. I had walked away from Vivian Media without looking back, content to let it rot in their hands. But if it was truly falling apart, if everything I had poured years of my life into was about to be destroyed, could I really ignore it? I exhaled sharply. James, why are you telling me this now? A weak chuckle. Because I don't have much time left. I clenched my jaw. What do you want me to do? Silence. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper. Save it. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying James's words over and over again. You're the only person I trust to fix this. Why? Why did he care now? Why was he asking for my help after everything he had done? More importantly, why was I even considering it? By the next morning, I had made my decision. I called a contact from my old business network and arranged a meeting. With a financial analyst. Can you get me the latest reports on Vivian media? I asked. The analyst hesitated. Evelyn, are you thinking of going back? No, I lied. I just needed to know. Within hours, I had the full picture. And it was worse than I expected. Vivian Media wasn't just struggling. It was drowning. I made a mistake, he admitted. I trusted the wrong people. I let Vivian handle things she wasn't ready for. And now? A long breath. Evelyn, I don't have much time left. But you, he stopped, coughing again, this time harder. You're the only person I trust to fix this. I froze. What? The company, James said. You built it just as much as I did. Maybe more. And now, it's falling apart. I shook my head. James, that's not my problem anymore. Maybe not, he admitted. But do you really want to see everything you worked for go to waste? I closed my eyes. Damn him. Damn him for knowing exactly how to get to me. I had walked away from Vivian Media without looking back, content to let it rot in their hands. But if it was truly falling apart, if everything I had poured years of my life into was about to be destroyed, could I really ignore it? I exhaled sharply. James, why are you telling me this now? A weak chuckle. Because I don't have much time left. I clenched my jaw. What do you want me to do? Silence. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper. Save it. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying James's words over and over again. You're the only person I trust to fix this. Why? Why did he care now? Why was he asking for my help after everything he had done? More importantly, why was I even considering it? By the next morning, I had made my decision. I called a contact from my old business network and arranged a meeting. With a financial analyst. Can you get me the latest reports on Vivian Media? I asked. The analyst hesitated. Evelyn, are you thinking of going back? No, I lied. I just needed to know. Within hours, I had the full picture. And it was worse than I expected. Vivian Media wasn't just struggling. It was drowning. Debt had piled up. Their biggest investors had pulled out. Contracts were falling through. In another 6 months, the company would collapse entirely. I stared at the reports, my mind racing. This wasn't just James's mess. It was my mess, too. Because once upon a time, that company had been my dream. And now, I had a choice to make. Would I let it die? Or would I do the unthinkable? Would I go back? That evening, I found myself driving to the hospital again. James looked even worse than before. His skin was pale, his body weak, his breath shallow. When he saw me, a faint smile crossed his lips. You came, he murmured. I sat down beside him. You always knew how to drag me back into a fight, James. He chuckled. Some things never change. I took a deep breath. Tell me everything. Every deal. Every failure. Every problem. If I'm going to fix this, I need to know it all. His eyes widened slightly in surprise. You're going to fix it? I nodded slowly. Not for him. Not for Vivian. But for me. For everything I had built. For everything I had lost. James's expression softened. I always knew you were stronger than me, Evelyn. I let out a small, humorless laugh. You should have figured that out a long time ago. His breathing grew more labored. And for the first time I saw the fear in his eyes. The realization that his time was running out. Evelyn, he whispered. Promise me something. I exhaled. What is it? He hesitated. Then, in the quietest voice I had ever heard him use. Don't let Ethan forget me. My throat tightened. For a long moment, I didn't say anything. Then, finally, I reached out, taking James's hand in mine. And for the first time in years, I let the past go. I promise. Part 5, Reclaiming What's Mine. James had finally spoken the words I had never thought I would hear from him, an apology, a plea, a desperate wish to not be forgotten. And against all odds, I had promised him. Now, I had a bigger battle ahead. Vivian Media was on the verge of collapse, and if I was going to save it, I needed to act fast. Not for James. Not for Vivian. But for myself. The first thing I did was arrange a secret meeting with the company's key investors. I met them in a sleek, high-rise office downtown, dressed in a fitted navy blue suit, my confidence radiating in every step. There were 5 men seated around the large glass table, all of them looking exhausted, frustrated, and, most importantly, ready to walk away. Gentlemen, I said, setting down the files I had prepared. Let's not waste time. You all invested in Vivian Media because it was once on of the most promising entertainment companies in the industry. Now, it's a sinking ship. But I have a plan to change that. One of them, a silver-haired man named Mr. Dawson, leaned forward. Miss Evelyn, we've already heard this before. Vivian made plenty of promises. None of them worked. What makes you any different? I met his gaze evenly. Because unlike Vivian, I built this company. And I know exactly how to fix it. There was a murmur of interest. I flipped open my file, revealing Finnan. Sile projections, restructuring plans, and, most importantly, an escape route for them. You all want to cut your losses. I understand that. But if you walk away now, you'll recover almost nothing. Give me 3 months. I'll turn this company around. And what do you want in return? Another investor asked. I leaned forward. Control. A few of them exchanged glances. You want ownership of Vivian Media? Mr. Dawson asked skeptically. I smirked. Vivian Media is already worthless in its current state. I'm offering you something better, a chance to be part of its rebirth. Silence. Then, finally, one of them chuckled. You've got guts, Miss Evelyn. I'll give you that. Mr. Dawson studied me for a long moment. Then, he tapped his fingers against the table. Fine. 3 months. You get full authority to make the changes you need. But if you fail, we walk, and the company collapses for good. Agreed, I said smoothly. I stood up, shook hands, and walked out of that room knowing one thing for sure. I was back. And this time I wasn't leaving empty-handed. Cutting out the rot. I didn't waste any time. The first thing I did was schedule a full audit of the company's finances. And what I found was worse than I had expected. Vivian had spent millions on luxury purchases, using company funds for her personal lifestyle. Exclusive designer clothes. Lavish vacations. Private jets. It was all there, buried under fake expenses and manipulated reports. The company wasn't just suffering. Vivian had been bleeding it dry. I clenched my jaw. I had no intention of cleaning up her mess while she walked away unscathed. So, I made my next move. I called Vivian. She picked up after a few rings, her voice cautious. "Evelyn? Meet me in my office," I said coolly. "We need to talk." There was a pause. Then, a hesitant, "About what?" "You'll find out soon enough." And then I hung up. A reckonin'. Gee. Vivian walked into my office later that afternoon, wearing a sleek black dress and oversized sunglasses, as if she were attending a Hollywood premiere rather than a financial intervention. Her belly was still slightly swollen from her pregnancy. But it was her face that caught my attention, exhausted, thinner than before, her usual confidence flickering. She sat across from me, crossing her legs. "So, what's this about?" I slid the audit report across the table. "This is what it's about." She sat at it, then waved her hand dismissively. "So? Every business has expenses." I leaned forward, my voice sharp. "These aren't business expenses, Vivian. These are your expenses. Personal shopping sprees disguised as corporate investments. First-class vacations under the pretense of networking. And my personal favorite, paying off your credit card debt with company funds." Vivian's expression didn't change, but I saw the flicker of panic in her eyes. "You don't have proof," she said. I tapped the folder. "I have everything. And so do the investors." Her lips pressed together. "What do you want?" I smiled. "That's the right question." I leaned back in my chair, savoring the moment. "You're going to sign over your shares in Vivian Media. Effective immediately." Vivian's jaw dropped. "What?" "You heard me," I said. "You don't deserve to have a single piece of this company. And if you refuse, I take these reports to the authorities." Embezzlement. T is a crime, Vivian. You could face charges. She stared at me, disbelief written all over her face. "You wouldn't dare," she whispered. I tilted my head. "Wouldn't I?" Silence stretched between us. Then, finally, Vivian let out a bitter laugh. "You really hate me that much, don't you?" I held her gaze. "I don't hate you, Vivian. You were never worth the effort." She flinched. Then, with a trembling hand, she reached for the pen. And signed. The final goodbye. After she signed, Vivian stood up, smoothing out her dress. "So, that's it?" she asked, forcing a smile. "You win?" I met her gaze. "I was never playing your game, Vivian. I just took back what was mine." She let out a soft breath. "James still loves you, you know." I went still. She gave me a knowing look. "Even when we were together, even when he married me, he was always looking for you." I exhaled slowly. "That's his problem. Not mine." Vivian studied me for a moment longer, then nodded. Without another word, she turned and walked out of my office. And just like that, she was gone. I let out a long breath, leaning back in my chair. Vivian Media was mine again. But there was still one last thing I needed to do. That evening, I went back to the hospital. James looked worse than before. His breathing was labored, his skin pale. But when he saw me, a faint smile touched his lips. "You came back," he murmured. I sat down beside him. "Vivian is gone," I told him. "She signed over the company. It's mine now." James exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. I knew you'd do it. Silence settled between us. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Evelyn, do you still hate me?" I swallowed hard. "No, James. I don't." His eyes closed, and for the first time I saw peace settle over him. "Good," he whispered. A few minutes later, James fell asleep. I sat there for a long time, watching him. And for the first time in years, I let go of everything. The pain. The anger. The past. Because I had a future. One that belonged to me, and me alone. Part 6, The Last Goodbye. James was slipping away. I could see it in the way his chest rose and fell, slow, uneven, struggling. The once confident, ambitious man who had built an empire was now nothing more than a fragile shadow of himself. I sat by his bedside, watching as his fingers twitched slightly, as if reaching for something, someone he would never have again. Vivian was gone. His company was gone. And soon, so would he. But even I didn't know what I felt. There was no love left between us. That had died long ago. And yet, there was something about watching someone you once shared a life with reach the end of theirs that did something to you. I had spent years resenting James. But sitting here, in this sterile hospital room, I realized I didn't hate him anymore. I just felt empty. The doctor came in sometime later, his expression grim. "He doesn't have much time left," he said gently. "If there's anything you want to say to him, now would be the time." I nodded. Then, before I could stop myself, I reached out and took James's hand in mine. It was cold. So cold. "James," I said softly. His eyelids fluttered, and after a few moments, he opened his eyes. A weak smile tugged at his lips. "Evelyn." I forced a small smile in return. "Still hanging in there?" He let out a breathy chuckle. "Barely." There was a long pause. Then, in a voice so soft I almost didn't hear it, he said, "I have so many regrets." I swallowed hard. "I know." He blinked slowly. "But my biggest regret is losing you." I inhaled sharply. James's gaze met mine, and for the first time, I saw something I had never seen in his eyes before. Not pride. Not arrogance. Just pure, raw sorrow. "I was blind," he murmured. "I spent why years chasing a dream that didn't exist. And by the time I realized what I had lost, it was too late." I didn't say anything. Because what was there to say? James had made his choices. And now, he was paying the price. He looked at me again, his eyes searching. "Do you think, if things had been different, we could have been happy?" I hesitated. Then, finally, I said, "We'll never know, James." He closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them again, they were glassy, distant. "Tell Ethan. Tell him I love him," he whispered. I nodded, my throat tightening. "I will." His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say more. But then his breathing slowed. And then, finally, it stopped. I sat there for a long time. The doctors came in. Nurses moved around the room, checking machines, whispering in hushed voices. Someone placed a hand on my shoulder and said something, but I didn't hear them. Because all I could hear was silence. For the first time in my life, James was truly gone. And with him, every last piece of the past I had been holding on to. Letting go. The funeral was small. James didn't have many people left. A few colleagues. A couple of distant relatives. And me. I stood at the back, holding Ethan in my arms as the priest spoke about James's life, his ambitions, his successes, the legacy he had built. But none of them knew the real James. None of them knew the man who had sacrificed everything for a love that wasn't real. None of them knew the man who had looked at me with regret in his final moments, knowing he had lost everything that ever mattered. As the ceremony ended, people came up to offer their condolences. I nodded, thanked them, and waited until the crowd had thinned. Then, I walked up to the casket, staring down at the man who had once been my husband. For a long moment, I didn't say anything. Then, softly, I whispered, "Goodbye, James." And just like that, I let him go. A new beginning. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding Vivian Media, no, Evelyn Media. It was mine now, in every way. The company flourished under my leadership. The artists who had once been suffocated under mismanagement finally had the support they needed. Investors who had once turned their backs were now lining up to be part of something great. For the first time in years, I wasn't living in someone else's shadow. I wasn't fighting to prove myself. I was just me. And that was enough. One evening, as I was going through reports in my office, Ethan babbled in his playpen beside me. I glanced at him, smiling. He was growing so fast. And one day, he would ask about his father. I didn't know exactly what I would say. But I knew one thing. I would tell him the truth. That his father had made mistakes. That his father had hurt me. But in the end, he had tried to be better, even if it was too late. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. I closed the reports, stretched, and picked up Ethan, holding him close. The past was behind me. The future was mine to create. And for the first time in a long time, I was free. Part 7, A Life of My Own. The days after James's funeral felt strangely quiet. For so long, my life had been wrapped around him, his choices, his betrayals, his regrets. Even after our divorce, he had still been a ghost in my life, lingering in the corners of my mind. But now, for the first time, he was truly gone. And I was free. It was a kind of freedom I had never known before. Not the bitter, vengeful freedom I had felt when I walked away from my marriage. Not the empty, illy freedom of starting over. This was different. This was real. Rebuilding from the ground up. Evelyn Media was thriving. I had worked day and night to restore the company's reputation, bringing in new talent, renegotiating contracts, and setting a foundation for long-term success. The same investors who had once been ready to abandon ship were now eager to put more money into the company. Even the artists who had once been suffocated under Vivian's mismanagement were now thriving, finally given the opportunities they deserved. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving. I was winning. And it felt damn good. Closure. One afternoon, as I was leaving my office, my assistant stopped me at the door. "Miss Evelyn, someone dropped this off for you." She handed me a small envelope. I frowned. "Who was it from?" She shrugged. "No name. Just said it was important." I took the envelope, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. I waited until I was in the privacy of my car before opening it. Inside was a letter. From James. "Evelyn. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I won't ask for it. But I needed to say this one last time. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. And I was the worst thing that ever happened to you. I should have chosen you. From the very beginning, I should have seen what was right in front of me. But I was a fool, blinded by a love that never truly existed. You built everything I had, Evelyn. And when I was gone, you built it again, this time, without me. I always knew you were stronger than me. And I'm proud of you. Take care of Ethan. Tell him about me someday, if you think he should know. I don't deserve it, but if he ever asks, tell him I loved him. And tell him I loved you, too. Even if I realized it too late. James. Tears pricked at my eyes, but I blinked them away. James had finally said the words I had wanted to hear for years. But they didn't change anything. They didn't change the past. And they didn't change my future. Still, I folded the letter carefully and tucked it away. Not for me. For Ethan. One day, he might want to know who his father was. And when that day came, I would tell him. The good. The bad. The truth. Moving forward. Years passed. Ethan grew up into a bright, happy child, full of laughter and curiosity. And as he got older, he began to ask questions. About his father. About the man he had never known. So one day, I sat him down and told him everything. I told him about the love that had built our family. I told him about the mistakes that had torn it apart. And I told him about the man who, despite it all, had loved him in the end. Ethan listened quietly, his little fingers tracing patterns on the couch. When I finished, he looked up at me with big, thoughtful eyes. Did he love you too, Mama? He asked. I hesitated, then nodded. Yes. But he realized it too late. Ethan was silent. Tea for a moment. Then he smiled. That's okay, he said. Because I love you. And just like that, all the pain of the past faded into nothing. I pulled my son into my arms, holding him close. James had been a chapter in my life. But he wasn't the whole story. Because this moment, with Ethan in my arms, with a future I had built with my own hands. This was my true happy ending.